The sky above the United Galactic Federation's capital was a tapestry of moving ships and bustling commerce, as diverse species from across the galaxy mingled. Amidst this vibrant chaos, Illyria descended from her ship, her eyes wide with both apprehension and curiosity. She had studied humans from afar, but interacting with them was another matter entirely. At the spaceport, Tom awaited her arrival. His job as a cultural liaison had accustomed him to dealing with aliens, but the Illyrians were a rarity. He checked his datapad, ensuring he had all details right. "Welcome to Earth, Illyria," Tom said, extending his hand with a warm smile. Illyria hesitated for a moment, then accepted the handshake, her touch tentative. "Thank you, Tom. I am eager to learn about your people." Tom nodded, leading her through the bustling terminal. "There's a lot to see, but I thought we'd start with something familiar to you. A visit to the Galactic Archives here. It has a rich collection of human history." "That sounds perfect," Illyria replied, her voice reflecting her relief. As they walked, Tom pointed out various landmarks and introduced her to the myriad aspects of human daily life: food stalls, selling everything from hot dogs to more exotic fare, musicians playing lively tunes, and holograms displaying news from around the galaxy. "So, humans enjoy music quite a bit?" Illyria asked, pausing to listen to a street performer. "Absolutely," Tom chuckled. "Music is a vital part of our culture. It expresses emotions that sometimes even words cannot capture." "What about Illyrians? How do you express creativity?" "Our expressions are more contemplative. We create through thought more often than action. Our art is about the flow of ideas," Illyria explained, her gaze lingering on the musician. Tom found this fascinating. "I'd love to learn more about that. Maybe you could show me sometime?" "I would like that," she smiled, warming up to his genuine interest. As they reached the archives, Tom ushered her into a vast hall lined with digital tomes and ancient artifacts. "Here we are, the heart of our history." Illyria was visibly impressed. "It's remarkable. The preservation of knowledge is something we value deeply as well." Tom guided her to a display. "This section covers the early space exploration era. It was a time of great challenges and even greater discoveries. Much like my visit here," Illyria mused, looking around in awe. "Yes, and just like us, you'll find that despite the challenges, the journey is worth it," Tom replied, giving her an encouraging look. They spent hours discussing various exhibits, with Tom explaining the context and significance of each. Illyria's questions grew more insightful as the day went on, her initial reserve giving way to a keen eagerness to understand the nuances of human life. As the day drew to a close, Tom suggested, "How about dinner at a place known for its view of the city? It's a nice way to wrap up your first day on Earth." "That sounds delightful," Illyria agreed, her earlier apprehension replaced by anticipation. As they left the archives, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the city, reflecting the new connection that was just beginning to form between them. Chapter 2: First Contact. The following morning, Tom met Illyria outside her residence, a sleek, glassy building designed to accommodate a variety of alien species. He had arranged to show her around the heart of Earth's cultural scene, its museums, theaters, and bustling marketplaces. His goal was to help her experience the raw energy of human creativity, a quality he thought might be both intriguing and puzzling to someone like her. "You ready for a full day of walking?" Tom asked as Illyria stepped out, her attire blending Illyrian elegance with a nod to human practicality. She gave a slight nod, adjusting the strap of a bag that likely held her recording device. "I am. I look forward to seeing more of how humans express themselves. You seem to channel so much into your creations." Tom grinned and led her down a cobblestone street that wound through a lively district filled with music, art, and the aroma of street food. "You'll find we're an expressive bunch. Art, music, architecture. These are ways we leave something behind, a way to tell our story." They stopped at an outdoor exhibit featuring massive murals painted on the sides of buildings. Illyria studied the bold colors and surreal shapes that seemed to leap from the walls. "You don't have these in Illyrian culture?" Not in this form, Illyria said, tilting her head. Our art is more ethereal. We create images that shift and flow in real time, never fixed in one place. They are meant to reflect our understanding of impermanence. Tom rubbed his chin. Interesting. For us, the permanence of a painting or sculpture can be comforting. It's like saying, "This moment mattered." Illyria considered his words, her expression thoughtful. I see. You capture a single point in time, as if it holds meaning beyond the present. They walked on, pausing at a small theater where a local troupe was rehearsing a play. The actors' voices spilled into the street, their lines sharp and impassioned. Illyria stopped, listening intently. What are they doing? It's called a play. A group of people performing a story for an audience. It's one of the oldest forms of storytelling we have. Tom motioned toward the performers. They're rehearsing, perfecting the timing, the delivery. That's why it might sound a bit rough right now. She seemed fascinated. Do you write down all the words in advance? Yep, Tom said. It's a collaborative effort. One person writes the script, others direct the scenes, and the actors bring it all to life. It's a kind of teamwork that creates something greater than any one person could do alone. Illyria studied the actors, her gaze intent. It must take a great deal of trust, each one relying on the other to create the whole. Tom nodded. Exactly. It's not just about talent, it's about the connections we build. The best performances come when everyone feels that bond. They moved on, eventually arriving at a market square filled with food stalls and artisans displaying handmade crafts. Tom stopped at a vendor selling colorful ceramic pots and picked one up. These are made by hand. Each one is unique. Feel the texture, he said, passing it to Illyria. She hesitated before running her fingers along the surface. It's warm. The imperfections make it feel alive. That's part of the charm, Tom replied. No machine could make something exactly like this. They wandered through the market, sharing small insights about their respective cultures. Tom would point out the history behind a carving or a dish, and Illyria would respond with parallels from her own world. She explained how Illyrians used holographic gardens to cultivate plants that could only exist in shifting light spectrums, while Tom talked about Earth's long tradition of botanical gardens and the human desire to preserve nature's beauty. As they stopped at a stall selling steaming cups of spiced tea, Tom turned to her. So, what's the most surprising thing you've seen so far? Illyria considered her response, sipping the tea cautiously before answering. I expected to see technological marvels, and I have. But what surprises me most is the passion humans put into the small things. Like your murals, your plays, and even these simple crafts. It feels as though your lives burn brightly because of the effort you pour into them. Tom smiled. That's a pretty thoughtful observation. I guess you could say it's one of the ways we try to make sense of our place in the universe. As they strolled back toward the quieter streets leading to Illyria's residence, the conversation grew more personal. They spoke about family, aspirations, and what they hoped to learn from this cultural exchange. By the time they reached her building, the sun was low in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. Thank you for showing me so much, Illyria said, her voice softer now. I've learned more than I expected. It's been a pleasure, Tom replied. Tomorrow we'll dive into some historical landmarks. But tonight, take it easy. You've had a full day. Illyria inclined her head. Good night, Tom. I look forward to what comes next. She stepped inside, leaving Tom outside with a sense of growing camaraderie. For the first time in his career, he felt like this wasn't just a cultural exchange. It was the start of something truly meaningful. Chapter 3, The Language of Touch. Tom met Illyria at the entrance of the city's largest museum. He greeted her with a bright smile and a casual wave. She returned his gesture with a slight incline of her head, a habit he'd come to associate with her Illyrian manners. As they walked inside, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors, Illyria's eyes darted around, taking in the intricately designed halls and the towering sculptures. I thought today we'd focus on how humans express themselves through physical artifacts. Tom began. Sculptures, carvings, textiles. things you can touch and feel. I know you mentioned before that Illyrian art is mostly conceptual and fluid, so I figured this might give you a sense of how we preserve moments in a tangible way. Illyria's gaze lingered on a massive, chiseled figure of a woman in a flowing gown. She took a step closer, hesitating, before extending a hand toward the sculpture's base. Are we allowed to touch these? Not all of them, Tom said quickly, gesturing for her to hold back. Some are fragile, but others, like those in the interactive exhibits, are made to be handled. I'll show you. He led her into a smaller gallery, where replicas of ancient artifacts were displayed alongside signs encouraging visitors to pick them up. Tom reached for a smooth, obsidian disc and placed it gently in Illyria's hands. Feel the texture, he said. This one's a copy of an old ceremonial piece. See how the edges are slightly uneven? That's because it was made by hand, not by machines. Illyria turned the disc over in her palm, her fingers tracing the shallow carvings. It's solid, permanent. We rarely keep anything so constant in our culture. Everything is allowed to evolve. Tom chuckled. Yeah, humans like to freeze moments in time. It's comforting in a way. As they moved through the exhibit, Illyria grew more curious. She reached for a carved stone tablet, then a replica of a delicate bronze pendant. Each time, Tom explained its origin and significance, weaving stories about the people who made these items and the rituals surrounding them. Touch is important to you, isn't it? Illyria asked after a while, her voice thoughtful. You have so many words, so much writing, but you also rely on tactile experiences. Tom nodded. Touch is a big part of how we connect. It's not just about tools or artifacts. It's about communication, a handshake, a pat on the shoulder. These things convey trust, comfort, even love. Illyria paused by a display of ancient pottery and glanced at him. I've noticed you use touch often. You put a hand on someone's arm when you talk to them. I saw you greet one of the staff with a quick hug. It seems so natural for you. Well, Tom said with a slight grin, it's not that humans always think about it. It's just a part of how we interact. I guess you could say touch helps us feel closer. They continued exploring the museum, discussing the differences between Illyrian and human perspectives. Tom grew more animated as he explained the history behind a particularly weathered sculpture, and Illyria listened intently, occasionally interjecting with observations about how Illyrians might approach something similar. Their conversations flowed more easily now, like water finding its course. By the time they reached the museum's upper floor, where a long balcony overlooked the sprawling city, the sun was beginning to set. Illyria walked to the railing, her pale features bathed in orange light. Tom joined her, leaning on the cool metal beside her. It's beautiful, she said, her voice quiet. I didn't realize how much your planet's light shifts over the course of a day. Ours is more stable. Yeah, sunsets can be pretty stunning here. Every evening's a little different, Tom said. He glanced at her, then pointed to the horizon. See how the colors change gradually? It's kind of like a slow painting. Illyria studied the scene, her expression calm yet contemplative. You humans find meaning in these shifts, in things that don't last. She trailed off, searching for the right word. It's touching. You hold on to moments by creating things you can feel, like the artifacts in the museum. I think I understand it a bit better now. Tom smiled at her. I'm glad you're getting something out of it. That's the whole point of this cultural exchange, to learn from each other. She turned to him then, her gaze meeting his, her voice soft. You've been very patient with me, Tom. Not just explaining everything, but helping me understand what lies beneath it all. I appreciate that. Well, he said, his tone light, you're not a bad student, and I'm learning from you too. It's a two-way street. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the fading light casting long shadows across the balcony. Illyria glanced down at her hand, resting on the railing beside his, and then at him. The question in her eyes didn't need words. Tom hesitated, then gently reached out, placing his hand lightly over hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her gaze softened, a subtle shift that Tom recognized as trust. A simple touch, and yet it felt significant. "I think I'm starting to see things the way you do," Illyria said, her voice steady but with a note of vulnerability. "Not just with my mind, but with my senses." Tom squeezed her hand gently, the smallest of gestures, but one that conveyed more than words ever could. "I'm glad," he said, his voice just as soft. "That's what connection's all about." And in that moment, amidst the setting sun and the sprawling city below, they both realized they were no longer just teacher and student, guide and visitor. They were beginning to understand each other on a deeper level, one touch at a time. Chapter 4. Under the Stars. Tom adjusted the focus on the telescope, squinting into the eyepiece. The observatory's open-air deck gave them an unobstructed view of the night sky, and he was determined to show Illyria something she hadn't seen before. Nearby, she stood with her arms crossed, gazing upward at the endless stretch of stars. "I'm not used to so much movement in the sky," Illyria said. "On Illyria, our world doesn't rotate as quickly, and our sun is more stable. We don't have the same shifting patterns of constellations you do here." Tom glanced over, impressed as always by her thoughtful observations. "That's part of what makes it special. The stars we see now won't be in the same place a month from now. They're always moving, kind of like us." She tilted her head, considering this. "Humans seem to take comfort in the transience of things." "Not always," Tom said, straightening up and stepping back from the telescope. "Sometimes we wish things could stay the same forever, but more often than not, it's the changes that make life interesting." She smiled faintly. "An intriguing perspective. Your shorter lifespans must make you see the world differently. We Illyrians often struggle to find value in moments that are fleeting." Tom nodded toward the telescope. "Come take a look. I'll show you something that might change your mind." She hesitated, then approached, lowering herself to peer through the eyepiece. Tom guided her hands on the telescope's controls. "See that cluster over there? That's the Pleiades. Some people call it the Seven Sisters." "It's beautiful," Illyria whispered. "The light seems softer, more delicate." Tom leaned a bit closer. "That light's been traveling through space for hundreds of years. When you look at those stars, you're seeing them as they were long before we even met." Illyria turned slightly toward him, still holding onto the telescope. "It's as if the stars themselves are telling a story." "Exactly," Tom said, smiling. "And that's what humans have done for centuries. Create stories out of the stars. The constellations are full of legends, myths, and even warnings. Each culture sees something different up there." Illyria returned to the eyepiece, adjusting the focus slightly. "So every human society sees its own meaning in the same sky?" "That's right," Tom said. "Some see gods, others see heroes or animals. It's all about interpretation." She stepped back, her silver hair catching the faint glow from the distant city lights. "Do you have a favorite story about the stars, Tom?" He leaned against the railing, looking thoughtful. "I always liked the story of Orion, the hunter. He's this great figure in the sky, chasing after the Pleiades. There's something poetic about that, always reaching for something just out of reach." Illyria regarded him curiously. "And yet, humans continue to try, even knowing they may never catch it." "That's kind of what we do," Tom said, grinning. "We keep trying, even when the odds are against us." They stood quietly for a moment, the stars above shifting ever so slightly. Illyria broke the silence. "We have our own stories, of course. On Illyria, there's a tale of two twin suns that once shared the same orbit. Over time, they drifted apart, each forming their own worlds. But those worlds still feel the echoes of their shared origin." "That's beautiful," Tom said softly. "It's different from what we tell, but it still has that same sense of connection." Illyria nodded, her gaze fixed on the heavens. "Perhaps it's universal. Perhaps all beings, no matter their world or their lifespan, look to the stars and search for meaning." Tom stepped closer, his voice low. "Or maybe we're just looking for someone to share it with." She turned to him, her pale violet eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "And have you found that person, Tom?" He met her gaze, the weight of her question hanging in the cool night air. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I think I might be getting closer." For a moment they stood together in silence. Then, almost instinctively, Illyria reached out and touched his hand. Tom's breath caught, but he didn't pull away. The simple contact sent a ripple of warmth through him, a connection that needed no words. "I never realized," Illyria said softly, her voice tinged with wonder, "how much a single touch could mean." Tom turned his hand to clasp hers gently. "It means a lot more when it's from someone who understands you." They stood like that, hand in hand, while the stars continued their ancient dance overhead. For both of them, this was more than just another night under the cosmos. It was the beginning of something neither had expected but both were now willing to explore. Chapter 5: Cultural Revelations. It was early afternoon when Tom arrived at Illyria's quarters with a collection of books, a digital reader, and a small case containing various Earth artifacts. He set them down on a low table in the common room and grinned at Illyria, who was seated by the window, studying a holographic map of the city. "I figured it was time for you to experience some of our literature," Tom said, tapping the stack of books. "Not the usual history tomes or academic texts. These are novels, poetry, even a couple of plays." Illyria turned her head, her silver hair catching the sunlight. "You're very determined to show me Ev. Gee." Illyria leaned forward, picking up one of the books, a slim volume bound in soft leather. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing slightly. "Your languages are so dense, layered. Each word can mean multiple things depending on context. That's one of the reasons humans tell so many stories," Tom said. "We're always trying to make sense of our emotions, our experiences. Writing gives us a way to explore what we can't always express out loud." Illyria held the book carefully, as if it might shatter in her hands. "Our people focus on clarity. When we speak, our words must convey exactly what we mean. Ambiguity is rare." "Sounds efficient," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "But doesn't it make it harder to capture complex feelings?" "Sometimes, a little ambiguity lets you explore different interpretations." She considered this, her gaze lingering on the book. "I suppose it's a different approach to understanding oneself. You embrace uncertainty, while we try to eliminate it. That's not to say one way is better than the other," Tom added quickly. "It's just different, and differences can be good. They give us more to learn from." Illyria placed the book down and reached for the digital reader. With a few taps, she opened a collection of human poetry. As she read, her lips moved silently, as though tasting the words. Tom watched her, intrigued by how deeply she seemed to dive into the text. After a few minutes, she looked up. "This poem, it speaks of longing, of reaching for something unattainable. It feels similar to one of our oldest Illyrian songs. The theme is the same, though the style is completely different." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Really? I'd love to hear it. What's the song about?" "It's about a traveler who wanders through the stars, searching for a place called the Eternal Garden," Illyria explained. "But the garden is a myth. It doesn't exist. The traveler knows this, but he continues his journey because the act of seeking it gives his life meaning." Tom smiled. "Sounds a lot like what we'd call a metaphor." "Yes," Illyria said slowly. "It's a metaphor for our lives, our search for perfection, knowing we'll never reach it." Tom leaned forward. "That's not so different from us, then. Humans spend their whole lives chasing dreams, knowing full well that some of them might never come true. The journey itself is what shapes us." Illyria's gaze softened. "I didn't expect to find such common ground. Perhaps we Illyrians and humans are more alike than I thought." As they continued their conversation, Tom opened the small case he'd brought, revealing a set of hand-carved figurines. He placed one in Illyria's palm, a wooden figure of a woman holding a small bird. "This was made by my great-grandfather," Tom said. "He was a carpenter who loved carving little figures like this. He said each one told a story, sometimes one that didn't have words. Illyria studied the figure, tracing her fingers over the delicate carving. You keep these as reminders of your history? Exactly, Tom said. They're a connection to the past, to the people who came before us. Each one is unique, and even though my great-grandfather's gone, his story lives on through these. Illyria nodded slowly. We do something similar, though we use holographic projections. It's interesting to see how humans create something so lasting with their hands. That's one thing I've noticed about Illyrians, Tom said. You're more about thought, less about physical creation. It's almost like you've transcended the need for objects. Perhaps, Illyria said, but I'm beginning to see the value in your way. There's something grounding about it. Tangible reminders of where you come from, what you've experienced. I can understand why these artifacts mean so much to you. As the day wore on, they discussed more stories, traded more cultural traditions, and even attempted to teach each other a few phrases in their respective languages. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they were laughing over Tom's failed attempt to pronounce an Illyrian proverb correctly. Well, Tom said, rubbing the back of his neck, I think I'll need a lot more practice. You're improving, Illyria replied, her lips curving into a rare smile. Perhaps one day you'll master it. I'll hold you to that, Tom said, grinning. Next time, I'll bring something new to show you. Maybe a human recipe. Cooking can be a great way to understand culture. I look forward to it, Illyria said, her voice steady but warm. Thank you for sharing all of this with me. Thank you for listening, Tom replied. It's not every day I get to introduce someone to all the things I love about being human. As they parted for the evening, Tom felt a growing sense of connection with Illyria, one that wasn't just about sharing knowledge or comparing cultures. It was something deeper, something that continued to grow each time they met. Chapter 6. The Challenge. Tom sat on the steps of the Interspecies Council building, his elbow resting on his knee as he checked the time on his communicator. Illyria was inside, attending a meeting with the Illyrian emissary who had arrived unexpectedly the day before. He'd only caught a brief glimpse of the emissary, a tall, silver-haired figure with an imposing demeanor, and that was enough to make Tom uneasy. He looked up when the building's tall doors opened, and Illyria stepped out. She seemed calm, but there was a faint tension in her movements. She approached him with measured strides, her expression unreadable. How'd it go? Tom asked, rising to his feet. The emissary has concerns, Illyria said simply. They question the nature of our interaction. Concerns? Tom repeated, frowning. About us talking? Learning from each other. Illyria hesitated, then nodded. They believe I am becoming too involved. They think I may lose sight of my role as an observer. Tom crossed his arms, his brows furrowed. That's not fair. All we're doing is learning about each other's cultures. Isn't that the whole point of this exchange? It is, Illyria said. But Illyrians value detachment. They see it as a strength. The idea that I might form an emotional bond with a human, someone so fleeting compared to our long lifespans, is difficult for them to accept. Tom stared at her for a moment, then shook his head. So what happens now? Are they going to make you stop talking to me? No, she said firmly. But they have advised me to maintain a more professional distance. Professional distance? Tom repeated, the words sour in his mouth. What does that even mean? It means I should avoid becoming emotionally attached, Illyria explained. I should remain impartial and focus solely on observing and recording. Tom let out a short laugh, his tone more bitter than amused. Great, so now we're just a research project. I don't see it that way, Illyria said quietly, and I don't intend to let them dictate how I conduct myself. I value what we've shared, Tom. It's just complicated. Complicated, Tom echoed, his voice softening. He glanced away, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I get that, but I don't think what we've been doing is wrong. We're not breaking any rules. We're just two people getting to know each other. Illyria stepped closer, her expression shifting to something more earnest. You're right. I don't regret anything we've done. But I must tread carefully. The emissary will be watching. Tom nodded slowly, then forced a small smile. Well, if that's how it is, we'll keep things low-key. No big dramatic gestures or anything. Just talking. Like always. Yes, Illyria said, her voice almost a whisper. Like always. They walked in silence for a while, leaving the council building behind. The streets were quieter than usual, the fading light casting long shadows across the pavement. So, Tom said after a long pause, trying to lighten the mood, what's next on your schedule? Any thrilling interspecies conferences coming up? Illyria gave him a sidelong glance. Actually, I was hoping we could visit the botanical gardens. I've heard they have an exhibit on Earth's extinct plant species. Extinct plants. Tom grinned. Well, honestly, it sounds kind of depressing. But sure, let's go. The gardens were a sprawling expanse of greenhouses and open-air plots, each section devoted to a different type of flora. Illyria moved through the displays with quiet fascination, her hands often clasped behind her back. Tom followed her lead, pointing out the more unusual specimens and cracking jokes about the stranger ones. This one, he said, gesturing to a towering, twisted tree with bright red flowers, used to grow all over Earth. Then people decided they didn't like the smell and cut most of them down. Now it's only grown in controlled environments. Illyria leaned in to sniff one of the flowers. It's not unpleasant. A bit sharp, perhaps, but not offensive. Guess we're more sensitive to certain smells, Tom said. Or maybe it was just another human overreaction. She straightened and looked at him. You speak about your species with both pride and criticism. It's interesting. Tom shrugged. We're not perfect. We've made plenty of mistakes, but we've also done some amazing things. I guess I see us as a work in progress. Illyria tilted her head. A fascinating perspective. Perhaps that's why you have such an effect on others. You see potential where others see flaws. He chuckled. You're giving me too much credit. I just like to keep things in balance. If I get too proud of humanity, someone will come along and remind me why I shouldn't be. If I get too critical, I remember the things we've overcome. Illyria didn't respond immediately. She seemed to be thinking, her gaze drifting to a cluster of delicate white blossoms. Finally, she said, I admire your honesty. It's rare for my people to admit uncertainty or imperfection. Perhaps that's something I can learn from you. Tom smiled, a genuine, warm expression. And I'll keep learning from you, too. As long as that emissary doesn't send you packing. Illyria allowed herself a small smile. I don't think they'll go that far. They continued through the gardens, their conversation lighter now, the earlier tension easing. Whatever the emissary thought, they both knew they had something worth holding on to, even if it wasn't always easy. Chapter 7, Unity in Diversity. The lecture hall was already packed by the time Tom and Illyria arrived. Tom looked around, impressed by the turnout. People of all species, from humans to Illyrians to other Galactic Federation members, filled the seats. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, a hum of conversation rising from the crowd. I didn't expect this many people, Tom admitted as he adjusted his presentation notes. Illyria stood beside him, her calm presence a stark contrast to his nervous energy. You've been sharing our discussions with your colleagues. It's only natural they'd be curious. Tom glanced at her. Yeah, but they're here for you, not me. You're the first Illyrian to participate in one of these events. I'm not the main attraction, Illyria replied, her voice steady. We're doing this together. This is about showing what we've learned from each other. Tom smiled at that. I appreciate the vote of confidence. When it was time to begin, Tom stepped forward first. The murmuring quieted as he greeted the audience, introducing himself and explaining the purpose of the presentation. Then, he handed the floor to Illyria, who began speaking in her soft but commanding voice. We Illyrians have always valued knowledge, and the pursuit of understanding has defined our long lives. Illyria began. But what I have learned in my time here is that humans bring a different perspective. Their creativity, their passion, and their willingness to confront challenges head-on have given me a new way to view the universe. Tom couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she continued, describing the cultural exchanges they'd shared. The art, the stories, the simple human gestures that had made such an impact on her. She was composed and thoughtful, yet her words carried a warmth that captivated the audience. When it was his turn to speak again, Tom highlighted what he'd learned from Illyria. Illyrians have taught me that some things are worth taking the time to understand. We humans often rush to find solutions, to fix problems quickly. But there's value in stepping back, looking at the bigger picture, and allowing ourselves to grow naturally. The presentation flowed smoothly, a true collaboration. They took turns presenting their observations, weaving a narrative of connection rather than difference. Tom found himself drawing strength from Illyria's quiet confidence, while her occasional glance in his direction reassured him that they were in sync. As the lecture progressed, Tom noticed nods of agreement from various species in the audience. Questions began pouring in, and the discussion became even more dynamic. One human attendee asked how Illyrians balanced their long lives with the pressures of galactic diplomacy. Illyria answered thoughtfully, describing how her people's long-term outlook allowed them to mediate conflicts without haste. A Zolorian engineer inquired about the role of human ingenuity in resource management, to which Tom responded with examples of Earth's recent breakthroughs in sustainable technology. He mentioned how the challenges of a rapidly changing climate had spurred humans to innovate, sometimes at an incredible pace. Each question brought more depth to the conversation, and Tom was struck by how easily he and Illyria complemented each other's perspectives. When one of them faltered or needed a moment to think, the other stepped in seamlessly. It felt natural, as if they had been working together for years. During a break in the questions, Illyria turned to Tom and said quietly, "You're handling this very well." Tom gave her a wry smile. "Coming from you, that means a lot." She tilted her head, her gaze steady. "I mean it. You're speaking from the heart. It resonates." After the presentation ended, the audience gave a genuine round of applause. A few attendees approached Tom and Illyria, thanking them for their insights and expressing hope for more events like this in the future. As they packed up their materials, Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That went better than I expected." Illyria placed a hand lightly on his arm. "It went as it should have. We both brought something unique to the table." He looked at her, grateful for her calm perspective. "You really believe that, don't you?" She met his eyes. "I do. We've both grown from this experience. And judging by the response, so have the people who listened." Tom found himself smiling. "You know, when we first met, I thought this cultural exchange was just going to be a formal assignment. Something I do, then move on. But it's become so much more than that." "For me as well," Illyria said softly. "It has been transformative." They walked out of the lecture hall together, side by side, their steps matching in unspoken agreement. For all their differences, it was clear now that they had become more than just cultural representatives. They were partners in the truest sense, exploring not only each other's worlds but also the possibilities that arose when those worlds came together. Chapter 8. Infinite Promise. Tom adjusted the straps on the pack slung over his shoulder, glancing toward Illyria as they navigated the uneven terrain of the high cliffs. Below them stretched a vast, emerald-green valley, dotted with ruins of a once-thriving civilization. The air carried a faint, sweet scent of flowering plants, blending with the sound of distant waterfalls. It was a landscape unlike anything he'd seen on Earth or the Galactic Federation's central planets. Illyria moved with an effortless grace, her Illyrian features calm and composed even in the rugged environment. The contrast between them, his quick, deliberate steps and her fluid movements, didn't feel so stark anymore. After months of traveling together, they had learned to move in sync, each adapting to the other's rhythm. "This place is breathtaking," Tom said, breaking the comfortable silence. He stopped to catch his breath, taking in the sweeping view. "I still can't believe you found it." Illyria glanced back, her faint smile the only acknowledgement of his comment. "It's a site we've known about for centuries, though few Illyrians have visited. It seemed appropriate to share it with you." Why appropriate? He asked, setting his pack down. He wasn't entirely used to Illyrian subtleties, but he had come to appreciate them. She stood at the cliff's edge, her pale hair lifting slightly in the breeze. This place represents a turning point for its people. They once believed in complete separation, and isolation from other species, other ideas. When that belief no longer served them, they chose integration. It was difficult, but they built a society that embraced diversity. Their ruins remind us of what can be achieved when we overcome fear of the unfamiliar. Tom walked to her side. Sounds like a pretty good message to take back with us. Illyria tilted her head. It's not a message I intend to bring to the Council or the Federation. This isn't about political gestures or public declarations. This is about us. Her words hung in the air. Tom glanced at her, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. What do you mean? She turned toward him, her gaze steady. When we first met, I was uncertain. About humans, about you. But over time, I've come to understand that our differences don't separate us. They enrich us. Tom felt a warmth rising in his chest. I'd say we've both learned a lot from each other. Yes, she said. But I've learned more than facts or cultural nuances. I've learned what it means to care, to connect, in a way my people have rarely considered. There was something in her voice, an openness he hadn't heard before. He hesitated, then reached out to lightly touch her arm. Illyria, are you saying? I'm saying, she interrupted gently, that I choose this. I choose us. Tom looked at her, searching for the right response. He didn't want to rush it, didn't want to ruin what felt like a fragile, profound moment. You're serious? Her faint smile returned, and she placed her hand over his. I am. We've come too far together for me to deny it. I know it's unconventional. I don't care about that, he said quickly. I felt the same for a while now. I just didn't know if it was okay to say it. Illyria's expression softened further. It's okay. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rushing through the valley. Then Tom chuckled, a quiet, almost disbelieving sound. Here we are, standing on some alien cliff, talking about us. It's surreal, isn't it? It is, Illyria agreed. But perhaps that makes it all the more meaningful. He nodded, squeezing her hand. So what happens now? We continue, she said simply. We explore, we learn, we grow. Together. Her words were calm, yet they carried a weight that made Tom feel grounded. The uncertainty he'd carried, the doubts about what was allowed, what was possible, faded. He looked into her pale violet eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw not just curiosity or caution, but something unmistakably human, hope. All right, he said, let's keep going. Together. She inclined her head, her lips curving into a genuine smile. Without another word, they turned and LF was enough. They didn't need promises or declarations. They only needed each other. And as they moved forward into the unknown, one thing was clear. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something new.